Welcome, Black Carnivores. Welcome back to the Black Carnivore podcast. I really appreciate your being here. And we are here today with Robert Sikes, otherwise known as Keto Savage. And he is like an OG in this space. And I know I talk about carnivore all the time, but I'm always happy to expand and also talk about keto and low carb because, frankly, this way of eating is incredibly healing. And wherever you find yourself on the low carb spectrum, is good with me. So I do love to talk to other folks and hear about other options. And I know that there's a lot of people that cycle in and out of carnivore and do low carb or keto on other days, and I think that's great. So I am really excited today to have this conversation and hear more from Robert. So why don't you tell us, like, how did you get into the health and wellness space and the keto space, and what keeps you here?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. First of all, I'm excited to be chatting with you. So I've been in the health space, nutrition space, bodybuilding, fitness space since probably, I don't know, I started bodybuilding as a junior in high school. That was back in 2008, 7 or 8, somewhere in there. I was like the skinny guy. I was 115 pounds, soaking wet. I was like just trying to lift to like look good for the ladies, I guess. I don't know. But I started getting into bodybuilding. Learned how to do a proper bicep curl, just the basics and stuff. And then I just became addicted with the sport of bodybuilding, and didn't really know what I was doing with my nutrition. So I just would read the magazines. They had all told me to eat a bunch of carbs and protein, eat 6 or 7 meals a day. So that's what I did. Did my first bodybuilding show in 2014, and I won that show, but it came at the cost of a bunch of disordered eating tendencies. I developed a really bad relationship with food. I do the whole binging and purging post show. Not a good time in my life as far as food, my relationship with food is concerned. But I did that for several more years, did 2 more shows. And then I just decided that I had to figure out a better way to go about this because what I was doing was not sustainable. I would do bulking phases and cutting phases to the point of, me getting up to 230 pounds and then cutting down to 150. So just too much flux in between, competitive seasons. So I started doing carbohydrate backloading, which is basically keto during the day and then a whole bunch of carbs at night. And that worked, but I felt better without the carbs. So I started doing carb backloading without carbs, which lo and behold is pretty much keto. And this was back in 2015, I believe. So before the big hype of keto came. So there was no books or podcasts or, blogs on the subject. So I just started doing that and it worked well for me. I competed in 2017 with a strict ketogenic approach, won my pro card that year. And from there on out, I was pretty much sold on keto as a lifestyle. And I've been doing it ever since I started in 2015. And I've since done a few more preps and just started educating people about what I've learned from, a performance standpoint with a ketogenic / carnivore diet. I'm not carnivore, like hardcore carnivore in the sense of, only eat steak, water, and, salt. But I pretty much like 99% of my food and calories comes from animal-based sources. So more or less on that carnivore side of the spectrum for sure.
Wow, that is quite a story, and I do have a bunch of questions, but I want to clarify for viewers the way that I look at carnivore. If you look at in science, the term hypercarnivore, it defines any animal that eats 70% or more of its daily calories from animal sources. So by that definition, if you're clean keto, you're carnivore. So I think that there's a range that people can, people can do in order to, in eating this way. And you really have to match like your goals to the way you're eating. So, if you're trying to like battle cancer, you're going to have to be really strict with carnivore if you're, if you're going down that route. And you're definitely going to want to eat like just, meat, salt, and water. But if you are, pretty fit, young, and don't have a lot of health things going on, then, you probably do have some more room for adding in, I don't know, fruit or salad sometimes, or artificial sweeteners and stuff like that. So, it really is a range, and you decide based off of how you want to feel.
Totally. Makes sense. I've actually only heard the term hypercarnivore, I don't know, a handful of times as of late. So I guess that's, I don't know, first time I've heard it, but it's a pretty new term, right? It's kind of just a more niche focus on the whole carnivore spectrum.
I think this like comes out of like biology textbooks. It's a totally different field, but that's the term that they use when defining certain animals and like how they eat, whether they're omnivores or herbivores or carnivores or hypercarnivores. So, yeah.
I'll rock that for sure.
So yeah, I mean, this is why I always say to people who are keto, like, we're on a spectrum really, from low carb to carnivore, and you decide where you want to be on that spectrum and how long you want to be in each spot. So, don't feel like you have to do, you have to make a decision. I am carnivore forever. Just do it as long as it feels good. And if it doesn't feel good, try doing something different.
Yeah, and I've always considered like carnivore like a more sub niche, but all within the keto spectrum, except for I guess if you're eating like if your version of carnivore is just simply egg whites and chicken breasts, that's probably technically carnivore, but not really optimized from a ketogenic standpoint because you don't have any dietary fat hardly. So yeah, I mean I consider it all kind of within the same spectrum for sure.
Yeah, egg whites and chicken breasts. God, that sounds awful.
Who wants that?
No.
Punishment right there.
Yeah, yeah. So, you have, I guess, quite a disordered eating history. I often think of like athletes and people who are into performance sports and stuff as being like, I mean, I guess the general public thinks of you all as being like the pinnacle of health. Like you look amazing, you're performing amazing, so everything must be amazing. But what you're describing doesn't sound like it was that amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of unfortunate because, like, within the bodybuilding industry, this is totally apart from, keto carnivore space, but just like within the traditional bodybuilding space, there's far more disordered eating tendencies that go, under unseen because people don't talk about it. Like, it's not really widely talked about, but it is widely accepted as that's just part of the territory of being in that space because people, they'll diet incredibly hard for months and months leading up to the show, and that show is over, they step off stage and they just kind of go into a tailspin and eat everything inside. They have no strategy post show. So like for me, my first show, I bulked up to 230 pounds and I'm 5'7", 5'8", so that's not a good look for me. I was way, way overweight, gained way too much body fat. And then I leaned down to 150, 153 in a matter of 12 weeks. So I lost about 80 pounds in 12 weeks, lost a bunch of muscle in the process, did everything incorrectly. Like I don't recommend it for anybody. This was all pre-keto. But then after that show was over, I put on, I don't know, probably 20 pounds in a matter of 24 hours. Like it was not a healthy endeavor at all. And then after that happened, my identity as a bodybuilder was tarnished because I felt like I had just thrown away all my self-control. And then that kind of led to the, binging and purging cycles that followed suit. And that is very, very common within the bodybuilding space amongst both male and female clients. So I think being open about that, like when I first started making YouTube videos and was open about that, people were shocked that I was, being forefront with that. But I feel like that's super important to talk about because, people look at, like the general public looks at these bodybuilders as those that have it all figured out and have a perfect relationship with food. And that's oftentimes not the case at all. So really just being honest and transparent with that. And then, for me, adopting a ketogenic diet was the thing that allowed me to break free of those disordered eating cycles and then regain control of my relationship with food. That's why I'm super motivated to talk about ketogenic bodybuilding as a, in tandem unit, because I feel like they go hand in hand and really help to optimize one's performance and hormonal function in the context of a competition prep, all while eating good quality natural foods.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I was going to ask, like, how many times can you go through this, like, weight gain, weight loss cycle before you tank your metabolism? Like, how did you do that going from 230 or up from 150 up to 230 and then back down again?
Yeah, it's not easy on the body. I mean, when you're having that much of a swing between weights, like you have to have two wardrobes. Like it's just not sustainable. It's not convenient, and it's just a pain. And like I was just doing everything wrong. Like, I was eating a whole bunch of processed food, a bunch of processed carbohydrates. I was eating 6,000 plus calories to build myself to that weight to begin with. It just wasn't optimal. And then whenever you do a caloric cut and you're in a competition prep, your metabolism is going to downregulate. That just comes with the territory, and that's natural. That's totally expected. But there's a right and a wrong way to go about upregulating that metabolic rate after the show is over. And when a lot of people do a cut, they drop their calories. They have that down regulation towards the metabolism. And then when the show is over, their leptin and ghrelin hormones are totally out of whack. So they've lost all sense of self when it comes to what true satiety and hunger is. So they basically just eat ad nauseum with no cap on it. And then when you do that in the state of having a downregulated metabolic rate, then your body's much more prone to put on unnecessary body fat. So you have a negative rebound post show, and people wind up oftentimes heavier than they were at the onset of the prep to begin with. And that's what you really want to avoid. Ideally, if done correctly, a competition prep and a building phase always, lets your body, return to a baseline that has improved upon where you were at the onset. But if you do things incorrectly, you're getting worse and worse and worse with each time you cycle through these different phases.
So it sounds like there's sort of a cap, if you start this at 20, by 30, can you keep going through those cycles? I mean, are you done?
Yeah, no, I mean, if you do it right, you can keep doing it, and it's a very positive thing. So, like for me, like a lot of people, they just want to maintain. But I mean, maintenance is kind of an unobtainable goal. Like we don't just maintain as a species because we're not getting any younger with every day that passes. So we're either getting better or we're getting worse. And if you do a cutting and building phase correctly, you can absolutely improve your starting and stopping position so that you are truly getting better with every phase that passes. So like me now, I'm always eating good quality foods. I'm in a strategic building phase and strategic cutting phase. I put on more lean tissue in my building phase. I cut down that body fat in my cutting phase. And then every time I do so, my starting and stopping positions are improved upon what it was the prior time I went through these phases. The problem is a lot of people, they cut down too frequently. They spend too much time in a chronic deficit. They don't have a proper building phase. They don't eat quality foods. So if you're cutting too regularly or you're in a chronic deficit for too long, then your ability to maintain and build lean tissue is significantly diminished. Your metabolic rate starts getting down regulated and just stays down. Your hormonal function starts to down regulate as well. So you can do it such that this becomes the fountain of youth, basically, and you get better with every year that passes. And you could do it so that it basically, takes away years of your life and screws you over from a hormonal and metabolic standpoint. The trick is, finding that sustainable line where you need to get better as opposed to getting worse. And that's what I think, is certainly achievable if you do it correctly.
Mm-hmm. So, a lot more, when I was younger, exercise was important, but weightlifting, we were all super scared of getting these big muscles and looking like Arnold Schwarzenegger. And it took many, many years of, deconditioning to kind of accept the fact that you have to work very hard to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger. That's not something that's just going to happen from, some squats. But I grew up with Lucille Roberts and, which you probably don't even know what I'm talking about, but the older people out there watching will, or, the pink dumbbells. So now I think, we're getting the message that weightlifting and heavy weightlifting and bodybuilding is for us and at any age. Ernestine Shepherd, I don't know if you're familiar with her, but, is like in her 80s, I think, and she is like an amazing bodybuilder. So, we do now have role models and people to encourage us. So what do you say to women, especially older women who are, just kind of trying to step off of the treadmill and kind of look at something else? So what advice would you give?
You gotta step off the treadmill and do some resistance training with weights. Like this fear amongst females that they're gonna just pick up a pair of dumbbells and all of a sudden look like Arnold Schwarzenegger overnight. It's just it's just ignorance. It's just not it's not gonna happen. Like the women that do look like Arnold Schwarzenegger are taking a whole bunch of performance enhancing drugs, steroids, trenbolone, like all of the stuff that's gonna make them look that way. For a woman to naturally look like that, it's not naturally going to happen. It's just impossible. It's a biological impossibility. So that fear needs to be removed, and just simply from education, like that's just not going to happen. But from a benefit standpoint, like what women and what men and women have to gain, and regardless of the age, from incorporating more resistance training is just magnificent. I mean, your ability to preserve muscle mass as you age from a longevity standpoint is going to be tremendously impacted in a positive way if you continue to demand something of that lean tissue. So as you age, if you do less activity, and honestly, if you're in a caloric deficit too, the less you demand of your muscles, the less reason your muscles have to stay there, because lean tissue, muscle tissue is very metabolically demanding. Like it requires a lot to feed and maintain that tissue. So if you're aging, if you're no longer doing those exercises, if your body recognizes that muscle tissue is not in demand, it's going to become very catabolic and start taking away from that tissue. The problem is, as soon as you start losing muscle tissue, your ability to have proper bone strength and density decreases, hormone function decreases, your metabolic rate drops down. Like having muscle is oftentimes referred to as the longevity organ. Like the more of that you have as you age, the better. So men, women, regardless of any age, they're going to benefit from doing anything they can to build and preserve that lean tissue.
Mm-hmm. And, I found that when the pandemic started, all of a sudden, all the things that I used to do in a day stopped. And I lived in New York City, so I would take the train multiple places, multiple times a day. So, I could end up walking up 25, 30 flights of stairs in a day through, all of those trips. Plus, I lived in a walk up. And I found that, the pandemic happened, and it's like all the ways that I just gained movement were just gone. Is it possible to replace that with just a workout? Like, what have you seen of people during the course of this pandemic? And now that we're sort of emerging out of it, what do people do?
Yeah, so a lot of people, like I feel very blessed because throughout the pandemic, I've got my own gym, like I've got my own facility here. So the pandemic and all the gyms closing down didn't really affect me at all. But that was certainly not the case for the vast majority of the populations who lost their gym memberships. We saw this massive uptick in people buying, home gym setups, which I think was great. Some people didn't have the means to do that. So just simply doing body weight and resistance band movements is great. I mean, anything is better than nothing. So, any type of stimulus is going to be good. And honestly, it's much easier to preserve lean tissue that you've already built than it is to build new tissues. So if someone has built a good base, the pandemic hit, they lost their gym membership, it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to maintain what they have built. Now, if you don't do anything with it, then it's easy to lose it. But if you just simply stimulate that tissue in some form or fashion and create some sense of demand, then you can do a lot with just body weight and resistance bands. Like when I'm traveling, I'll bring a set of resistance bands with me. I'll do body weight movements, and I can get a super solid workout in with just the bare minimum from an equipment standpoint. Now, if you have access to the gym, then great, take advantage of it. But don't let not having access to a gym be a limiting factor that prevents you from doing something and stimulating that tissue.
Mm-hmm. And the goal is to always be progressing. I mean, is there any point where you're like, okay, I hit the muscle goal and now I lift, this amount of weight every single time for good?
Yeah, so the concept of progressive overload is key, because progressive overload is, as it sounds, basically progressively overloading the muscle. So for instance, if you walk in the gym and you do 3 sets of 10 reps on bicep curls with 20-pound dumbbells, for instance, that's all you ever do for biceps. Once your body acclimates to the point where it's built enough tissue, enough muscle tissue in your arms to be able to efficiently and effectively accomplish that load, it doesn't really have much reason to continue to add more tissue. However, if you implement some form of progressive overload by either increasing those 20-pound dumbbells to 25-pound dumbbells, or maybe you increase the rep count to 12 instead of 10, or maybe you do 4 sets instead of 3, or maybe you have more time under tension, so you're going slower with that rep count, or maybe you're doing a drop set in which you do as many as you can with that 20-pound dumbbell, then you do as many as you can with 15 pounds, then 10 pounds. Any form of progressive overload, apart from just simply adding weight, is going to provide an additional stimulus that creates more demand for that muscle to grow and adapt and have that hormetic effect. And that's basically what progressive overload is in its simplest form. You got to give the body more demand, more reason, more stress, acute stress, to give it reason to grow and add more tissue in the first place.
So is that the goal? Because a lot of women, kind of are like, okay, I'm going to go do my workout. I'm going to do 45 minutes on this, and then I'm going to do so many squats and blah, blah, blah. So I don't know that everyone kind of has the idea that each and every workout should be a little harder, or, that you always want to be challenging yourself. So not just kind of doing it, but like going further each and every time.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to that maintenance thing, because again, we can't really maintain. I mean, we can maintain in the sense that not enough is changing on a day-to-day basis that we convince ourselves that we're maintaining. But if you, for instance, go in there, like if you're a 20 5-year-old female, and you go in there and you do the exact same exercise every single day, same weight, same rep count, same everything, and you do that for the next 10 years, if you look at that 25-year-old female side by side with a picture of her at 35 and then 45 and 55 with her doing the exact same load, you're probably going to see a decline because her body, I mean, time is taking its toll regardless of what you're doing with the gym. So if you can fight that decline from what time subjects us to by simply requiring more from a lean tissue standpoint, from a muscle building standpoint, that is able to offset. I mean, it's not like you're going to be able to step in a time machine and rewind the clock, 20 years. Like, you still have time playing against you, but anything you can do to offset that by progressively overloading the muscles and creating more demand and more reason for additional lean tissue growth is going to be advantageous as time passes.
Okay. So I'm sorry, I feel like I'm asking like super basic questions,
No, you're good.
But these, when I work with clients and I don't, really want to do the exercise part, I don't have, that's not like my wheelhouse. So, I do feel like these are some of the kinds of questions that I have been asked. So really what you're saying is, with the progressive overload, you're constantly building and you're trying to offset what you're constantly losing as, each and every day goes by and we get older and older. So you might get to a point where you're maintaining because what you're gaining is about equaling what you're losing.
Yeah, and like as we age too, like our hormones, or I said that funny, our hormones start to decline, and our bone structure starts to weaken. Like, all of these things just come along with the territory of getting older. However, if we're able to create more demand, put our body through more stress, have this hormetic response to those adaptations and fighting against that stress, those are all things that can be there to offset that. So like having more muscle tissue is going to improve your ability to have more testosterone, better regulated hormone functions, both male and female. It's going to require you to have more and better bone density. So all of these things can kind of offset or certainly minimize the adverse effects that time plays on the human body. So anybody would benefit from that. And it doesn't have to be like, you don't have, like, if you absolutely hate weight training, you don't have to go to the gym and weight train. Like, you can find other ways to create demand for your body, stimulate that lean tissue, stimulate your skeletal structure, stimulate your respiratory needs. Like, there's other ways to accomplish that goal, but resistance training is a great and efficient way to do just that.
Yeah. I don't know, for the ladies who are watching this, I preferred it because I didn't get quite as sweaty as being on the treadmill, and that helped with my hair and makeup. But I did enjoy it. I definitely did. So, and that was one thing too, when I was in the gym, I would see, some guys would come in and they'd be talking on their phones and they'd be like kind of lifting and, making a lot of noise and, taking up a lot of space. And then other people I'd see come in with like their little notepads and they're keeping track. And so how should you approach the gym? Do you need a notepad? Like, what are those guys doing?
Yeah, so when it comes to like the notepads or like tracking, I mean, like when you think of nutrition, for instance, there's lots of different ways to do nutrition. You can be very intuitive with your nutrition. Like, if you've got everything dialed in, your carnivore diet, you know that you're going to have a coffee with heavy cream, 6 eggs and 5 pieces of bacon for breakfast, and a ribeye steak for dinner. You're good. You don't need to put that in a macro calculator every single day. Some people that are trying to figure things out, they may use a macro calculator. Some people are old school. They want to write it out on pen and paper. Same concept holds true with regard to training techniques. So like, some people want to train very instinctively and just feel their body out and let their body do what they want to do. If they've got a specific goal in mind, they're trying to implement progressive overload. If they're trying to make sure that they're adding more weight to the bar every time they go into the gym, they may have an app, they may have a notepad, they may have some way to track and quantify those changes over time. That's going to be largely personal preference. Now, if they're on their phone just doing TikTok videos and not working out, that's when it becomes a point of like, hey, it's probably not a worthwhile use of your time in there. Like, I like to attack whatever I'm doing with intensity and purpose. And that's definitely the case when I'm stepping into a gym. So when I go into the gym, I go in there with a specific purpose. I know exactly what I'm training that day. I'm going to train those muscles very hard. I'm going to cause enough acute stress for my body to be motivated to have a hormetic effect from that, build more lean tissue so that I can recover, in a quality stance, and then attack it even harder the next time I walk in the gym. So I go in there with purpose. And as is with everything in life, like you are going to get more back from whatever you attack with intensity and purpose, as opposed to you in there and you half-ass your workouts, you're probably not going to get the great results. Just as if you go into the kitchen and you're kind of half-assing your nutrition, you have a lot more leniency to what you're eating, you're probably not going to get optimal results there either.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So I get I mean, I do, I don't know why, but do get some, athletic types who ask about whether it's possible to build muscle on a purely carnivore diet. Is it possible to put on bulk without having carbs?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I get that pushback a lot as well because I haven't had carbs in, 7+ years. I've been strict keto this entire time, but I've built more muscle with every year that passes. I look better every single time I compete. Like I've gotten better. And a lot of people are under the assumption that you have to have carbohydrates from energy standpoint. I would imagine most people listening to your podcast, that they're not eating carbohydrates and they still have energy. So hopefully that's not an argument that they would have against it. But for the people that think that you have to have a spike in insulin from carbohydrates to build more lean tissue, that's not really true either. I mean, the main thing is you have to have enough protein to build more tissue. You have to have enough calories, enough energy coming in to allow your body to have the building blocks to build more tissue. And you have to have, a stimulus. You have to give your body reason to have the need to build more tissue. So that's going to come from the training. All of that works in tandem to create more muscle protein synthesis and build more muscle mass. So if you're eating enough protein and training hard enough, you'll grow.
Mm-hmm. And so do you have to put on a bunch of weight in order to put on muscle? I mean, that bulking phase, like let's say you are, and maybe answer this question, can you lose fat and gain muscle simultaneously? But let's say, you're still losing weight. How do you have to bulk up in order to gain that muscle? Like I see people talking about eating, I don't know, 3,000 and 4,000 calories when, from years of dieting, my head is stuck around like 1,500 calories.
Yeah, no, great question. So, I've got a questionnaire on my client list. So anytime I get a new client, I have them fill out a questionnaire, and at the very bottom, it's like, what is your primary goal? And everybody's answer is always, I want to build muscle and lose body fat. That's everybody's answer. Who doesn't want that? The problem is you can do those simultaneously, but they kind of compete for one another. In order to optimize one's ability to build more muscle, you need to be in a caloric surplus. In order to optimize one's ability to burn more body fat, you need to be in a caloric deficit. So you can do both. You're just not going to do both well. So I always encourage people to have one primary objective, whether that is to build muscle or to to lose body fat, and then double down on that, reach that goal, and then shift focus to the next goal as needed. So that's why I have a legitimate building phase and a legitimate cutting phase, because I'm able to optimize for those goals during that specific time, as opposed to always kind of being in limbo, purgatory, and never really reaching my full potential in either of those. Now, that said, you don't have to have a crazy bulk and put on a ton of extra weight and body fat in order to build more muscle tissue. So when I did my first competition, I bulked up to 230 pounds, and then I cut down to 150 and had an 80-pound difference. That's totally not necessary and certainly not optimal. You're just going to be taxing your body throughout that big of a window. Now I stay within about 20 pounds of my stage weight. So I'm at a caloric surplus right now. I'm eating at least 3,000 calories a day. I'm training hard. I'm eating enough protein, enough calories, and I'm about 20 pounds over my stage weight. When I cut down for a competition next year, I'll drop those calories, and I may still build some muscle during that competition prep, but it's not going to be as much as I'm building right now. My main goal there shifts from building muscle to preserving as much muscle as possible and losing as much body fat as possible. That's all going to happen with that caloric deficit and kind of how I'm tweaking my macros and whatnot. But yeah, I always encourage people just to have one primary goal, whether that is to build muscle or to lose body fat.
Mm-hmm. So the key, listening to you with talking about the cutting phase, I would assume that everyone would think keto is the best way, at least in the cutting phase, because isn't that the best way to preserve muscle while still losing fat? I mean, scientifically, there's studies showing that, right?
Yeah, that's certainly my belief. Interestingly enough, like when I compare them, because I used to do the cutting phase before I was keto. I did the traditional super high. I mean, in most bodybuilding circles, what they do is they'll do super high protein, very low fat, and then depending on where they're at, either higher carb or lower carb. Like they'll oftentimes competitors will do, 300 plus grams of protein a day, 30 grams of fat, and then they'll drop carbs very low the last month or so of their prep to lean out as well. The problem with that is they're not fat adapted, so they're pretty much walking around like zombies because they're not really getting much energy from carbs. Their fat is really low, so their body is inefficiently converting protein through gluconeogenesis for glucose. They don't feel optimal, and oftentimes because of that, they lose a lot of tissue because they're not training as hard. And training hard is one of the best ways to preserve lean tissue in the context of a deficit. So they're walking around like zombies. Their hormones tank because they're not consuming enough dietary fat. They have no energy, so they can't train hard. So they're losing muscle in that regard. So even though their protein's very high, and they think that because protein's high, they're going to be able to preserve lean tissue, I'll oftentimes be at a very higher fat intake, moderate protein intake, and then obviously very low carbs because I'm keto. And my hormones don't tank as much. My energy is much more stable, and I'm able to train hard. And I honestly preserve much more lean tissue, all while consuming less protein than they are. So that's been kind of my findings personally with my prep protocol since I've adopted a ketogenic diet, and I've been able to replicate that with my clients. So I'm certainly of the belief that a ketogenic prep is much more favorable than a traditional high protein, low fat, low carb approach.
Okay. And in order to cut, you have to cut calories. A lot of people come to carnivore. They're veterans of the diet wars and have spent years, restricting and counting and tracking and weighing and stuff. And so a lot of times I get people who are just like, I can't. I don't want to count anything. I don't want to do any of that. So, do they do you need to cut calories? Like, I feel like we get conflicting messages in this space about calories and their importance.
Yeah, totally. It's a good question. So the beauty of the ketogenic diet, the carnivore diet, especially one that follows a pretty, single ingredient, wholesome, naturally organic sourced food group. I mean, you're eating quality foods. You have a much more in tune relationship with your food. Like you're not having these hyper palatable foods. You're not having crazy fluctuations in your blood sugar and blood insulin. So your cravings and your none of that is really a factor when you're really dialed in, fat adapted, and following a properly implemented ketogenic carnivore diet. So from an intuitive eating standpoint, it's much easier to follow a ketogenic or carnivore diet. Let your body be intuitive with your natural hunger and satiety signals because you're not having all that noise in the equation brought on by hyperpalatable, heavily processed foods. That said, if you're trying to optimize for fat loss, you definitely do need to be in a caloric deficit. Now, it's much easier to be in a caloric deficit while still getting ample micronutrients and minerals from quality foods. So it's oftentimes much more sustainable for people to do that following a ketogenic carnivore diet, and also much easier for them to kind of dip into a deficit without really intentionally trying to be because they're eating just quality foods. They have better satiety from those foods. Their body's not minerally deficient. They don't have the cravings. So it's much easier for them to not track, have a deficit happen automatically by default, just simply by listening to their body's natural signals, and then lose body fat without ever having to track a calorie. That said, you can certainly gain body fat while eating a totally intuitive carnivore ketogenic approach as well if you're consuming too much. So the amount of food you are consuming is very important, very critical. Calories do definitely play a role. But I mean, that's not a bad thing. Like think of calories as fuel. I mean, that's all it is. It's just fuel. If you're under consuming fuel, that's going to have an impact. If you're over consuming fuel, it's going to have an impact. The word calorie in and of itself has gotten a bad rap because of all the dieting culture that we've been inundated with, for years and years and years. And then a lot of people in the traditional bro diet setting, they like to oversimplify things and say, look, man, just cut calories, eat less, move more, boom, problem solved. And that's oftentimes, it's just a much more nuanced conversation than that because hormones play a factor, energy balance plays a role, one's own psychological relationship with food plays a role. Like all of these things matter. So to distill it down to its simplest core and just say eat less, move more is just honestly an oversimplification of the entire equation. But yes, to sum up, the amount of calories, the amount of energy you consume definitely does play a role. And there's been this push in the carnivore space that calories don't count, eat them ad nauseum, don't worry about it. And I think that's, at the core, I think what the messaging is just simply trying to play into people who are exhausted of tracking in the first place. They want to make it sustainable. So I totally get that. But I think as a result of that, many people in the space have assumed that, calories are a moot point that don't exist in the first place. And that's certainly not the case either.
Mm-hmm. And well, I mean, I do see some people really focusing on consuming high amounts of butter. And, I mean, I'm not, an expert, so I feel like it's not my place to say anything, but I wonder, like, at a certain point, like those are just calories. They might be great and, you might get a lot of buzz and energy, but it's still overnutrition, as you say. I mean, it's like, I imagine, if I were driving down the road and the gas cap were off my car and gas is just splashing on the street, like I wouldn't want to do that.
Yeah, and the same thing is true with like protein too. Like protein has been given this halo as of late, and people are under the assumption that you can't overconsume protein. That's certainly not the case either. Like if you're eating 4,000 calories a day and 90% of it's coming from pure protein sources, like you're just not going to feel optimal. Period. Like you just won't. Like your body's like protein is not a great substrate for energy. So if you've got a set allotment of calories that you're able to consume without having any adverse effects, and the vast majority of that is coming from protein, you're not going to feel optimal from an energy standpoint. You're probably not going to have the best quality sleep. You're going to have more brain fog. Like protein is incredibly important, but to give it a halo and say that you can consume it, without a cap is not really optimal either.
So how do you know how much to have? I mean, when you read the magazines and, the blogs and stuff, like there are all these formulas, but I always wonder if, the formula that's built for somebody who's eating the standard American diet or, like an elevated standard American diet, how do those formulas translate to somebody who's eating keto or carnivore? And and do you need to kind of think about it differently?
Yes, there's a bunch of formulas online. There's a bunch of macro calculators online. And honestly, the answer is really nuanced because it depends on what your goals are. It depends on if you're in a caloric deficit, a caloric surplus, if your goal is to build muscle, to burn body fat. It depends on your personal preference towards certain food types. It depends on your psychological relationship with food. So I've got a macro calculator on my website, but I'll be the first to tell people that, look, whatever that number gives you is not the number that you need to stick with for the rest of your life. Like it's not set in stone. It's a starting point. Then from there, you have to tweak. Whenever I'm working with clients, I'll typically start them at a higher fat ratio so that we can, ensure their body is truly fat adapted. They're able to use fat for energy. And then I'll start titrating protein up to figure out what their unique protein threshold is. That's going to be very different with every one of my clients. Like some it's going to be higher, some it's going to be lower. Sometimes, whether you're male or female is going to dictate what that threshold number is. Lots of variables there. So there's not really a set in stone number that, hey, this is what everybody should eat. That said, a good general, again, I said not to use the word maintenance, but I'm going to use it here. Like a good general everyday point from a protein standpoint is if you're consuming about 1 gram protein per pound of, lean mass or something like that, like that's a pretty good general ballpark for most people to consume protein wise while not worrying about being catabolic and having enough to build more tissue. That's a pretty good general ballpark for most people.
Okay. Because I mean, I do have people who are eating upwards of 200 grams, and they are, like women 5'7", moderate size. So that seems like maybe excessive.
Yeah, I mean, like I'm 5'8", I weigh 180 pounds. I'm in a building phase right now, and I'm typically consuming about 200 grams of protein. I've got a female client that's going to be competing, so she's in a fat loss phase. Her calories are lower right now because we've been dieting down for her show. She's got like if she weighs 120 pounds, for instance, and she's getting 300 grams of protein, that's not a good use of her total caloric allotment because then she's going to be sacrificing some dietary fat to have that higher protein intake. If she's sacrificing that fat, she's not getting that energy in, so she's not going to feel optimal. So that number is going to be different for everybody based off of where they're at, what their lean mass is, what their training is like. Lots of variables to play with there. but honestly, just simply making small adjustments, like starting at some position and then increasing or decreasing in incremental adjustments week by week by week until you figure out what's best suited for you, is probably the best way to go about finding that sweet spot.
And what are the signs that you're looking for? Is it not gaining strength the way you think you should, or not recovering the way you expect
Yeah,
to?
yeah, recovery. I mean, you want to make sure you're consuming enough protein to build more tissue, get stronger, you know, have good recovery, all that stuff. But there's a point at which you start increasing your protein to the point, you know, where like you're sacrificing energy calories, and you'll oftentimes notice more brain fog, less energy overall, more bloat, more stomach bloat, for instance, less quality of sleep. Like there's certainly a point of diminishing returns of protein for sure.
Okay, so you kind of have to be in tune with your body and be noticing these signs, and they
Yeah,
could be subtle in the beginning. So, yeah.
totally. And you don't have to track everything, but like just simply having self-awareness is key. I mean, like I know that if I, uh, you know, eat 2 pounds of chicken breast right before I go to bed, I'm not going to sleep as good. But if I have that same calorie in, you know, a relatively high fat meal, I'm going to sleep much better. Like all of these things are things that you kind of pick up over years and years of just trial and error and figuring out what your body responds well to.
Gotcha. And do you do any fasting? Like, where does fasting fit in with bodybuilding, or does it,
Yeah, so
or
I
fitness?
I don't do a ton of extended fasting. I'll do like a lot of people. Actually, let me rewind. I don't ever recommend extended fasting with fat loss and weight loss being the goal. Like, I don't think those two should go hand in hand. That's just too many stressors on the body. A lot of the benefits you're getting from fasting are going to come from simply being in a caloric deficit. Now, I'll do intermittent fasting pretty much every day. Like, I'll wake up, I'll have a fatty coffee, like just some heavy cream in my coffee. So, depending on how strict you want to be with your fasting protocol, that's technically breaking a fast. But I won't have my first meal containing, you know, protein or anything like that until several hours later. So I'm doing an intermittent fast in that sense. Now, when it comes to extended fasting, I'll do that, you know, once in a blue moon if I'm in a caloric surplus. So if I'm eating, you know, 3,500 plus calories a day, I'm in a building phase. My body's digestive system's been hammered by just eating a lot of food. I'll sometimes throw in an extended fast to give that digestive system a break, and then kind of, you know, reset itself for the next influx of calories. But I don't do that when I'm in a deficit because I'm already not consuming that many calories. But
Well,
yeah,
what is an extended fast by that definition? I mean, in that circumstance.
yeah. So if I'm doing extended fast, for me, extended fast is anything over 24 hours. So in that context, for instance, if I'm eating 3,500 plus calories, I'm in an aggressive, you know, surplus building phase. I may do a, you know, 3-day fast every quarter or every 6 months or something like that. The longest I've done is 5.5 days, but I've only done that twice. Like that's not something that you need to do from a fat loss standpoint. It's not something you need to do from a, I mean, if you're like trying to prevent cancer cell growth, if you're trying to really, you know, lean into, you know, cell autophagy, and there's more nuance to be had there. But yeah, definitely don't recommend extended fasting from a weight loss or fat loss standpoint. And then with the intermittent fasting, you know, anything fasted from like within a 24-hour revolving period, I think that's totally fine. And when my calories are lower, like they are towards the last month or 6 weeks or so of a prep, and I'm doing OMAD, I'll typically have, you know, a pretty significant intermittent fast just by default by doing OMAD.
Hmm. So the intermittent fasting, you're still getting the total amount of calories and nutrients in a day. You're just having it in a restricted time period.
Yep, exactly. And for me, that's just more sustainable. Like if I'm hungry, which I'm going to be if I'm in a prep, if I'm eating, you know, 1,900 calories, for instance, towards the tail end of a prep, then for me psychologically, it's more satisfying to have one large meal that actually fills me up and creates the sense of satiety than to have like those same calories spread over 5 or 6 meals that always just kind of leave me wanting more and always hungry.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah. So I've heard people say that well, exercise produces as much, if not more, autophagy than you know, a given fasting period. So there's some talk from people like, don't fast, like work out more. That's a better way to go about getting that autophagy if you're going into fasting for the purposes of autophagy. Have you heard that, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, I have heard that. And honestly, like if you're trying to look at different things you could do from a longevity standpoint, and break everything down to like a classic 80-20 analysis of like what are the things that you can do that are going to yield the most results. Honestly, weight training is probably top of the list. I mean, that's probably going to be your single best thing anybody can do to preserve lean tissue, bone health, hormonal health, metabolic health. Like that's probably going to be your biggest hitter right there. Now you can certainly throw in the extended fasting, but if I had to look at if I had a sample of people and I had a group that was doing consistent weight training and a group that was just doing consistent extended fasting and no weight training, then I'm going to put my chips in the basket of those that are doing weight training on a regular basis when I'm determining who's likely going to have the best quality of life and health span, not just lifespan, but overall health span. I'm definitely going to double down the chips in the group of people that are doing resistance training. Now, if you combine those in a sustainable, strategic manner so that you've got people that are weight training, but then also doing strategic intermittent fasting and then an occasional extended fast, I think that's probably going to be your best bet.
Mm-hmm. But more on the way that you're talking about doing it, like quarterly or something like that, rather than, people are doing OMAD day in, day out, or maybe a 3-day fast, weekly, or, a couple of times a month. I don't know. Do you think
Yeah,
that's too much?
with the extended fasting, it's really easy to put yourself in just a chronic deficit. So, like, there's a lot of adverse effects that are in a company being in a chronic deficit. Like, that's why I'm not a fan of like protein sparing modified fasts and things of that nature, which are really ultra low caloric intakes for days on end. That's just not optimal. Certainly not from a muscle preservation and muscle building standpoint, or hormonal or metabolically speaking. So if you're doing extended fasting, if you're doing a 3-day fast every single week, you've got to eat a lot of calories on those other days to make sure that you're not in a deficit. Make sure that your average intake is not in a chronically depleted state. So I don't think doing an extended fast of 3 days every single week is necessary or optimal. Now, if you're normally in a surplus, like if you're eating on average, it's going to be totally different for everybody. But for me, 3,500 calories would be a pretty significant or, a pretty moderate surplus for me. If my maintenance is about 3,000, if I'm eating 3,500 pretty much every single day, then most of my time is in a surplus. Then having a quarterly 3-day fast or a monthly, 2-day fast or something like that is going to be much more sustainable, much more realistic than if I was to try and do, a 3-day fast every week and then get, whatever it's like 6,000 some odd calories on those that would not be fun at all.
Well, depends on what you're what you're using, but
Yeah.
I get it. Yeah, I get it. Okay, that's really helpful. Because I don't know. I mean, it was interesting. I was at the Low Carb San Diego conference last week, and Steve Finney gave a presentation, and during the Q&A period, I don't know, somebody had asked a question about something, and he's already like been pretty vocal about not being a fan of fasting and feeling that it the first day or two of fasting you just lose a lot of muscle, and then you continue to lose muscle through the fast, although in the longer fast, although it slows down the amount that you lose. But he also said in the Q&A period that he's noticed a lot of influencers and people who have done a lot of fasting, extended fasting, more than 24 hours, and doing a lot of it, each week or each month, they're kind of backing away from the message, and they're also looking a lot older and having more difficulty building muscle, and that he was sort of using that as proof for his argument. But I did start thinking about it, and I was like, kind of like, yeah, people are maybe not talking about fasting in the same way that it used to be. And it seemed like it was a perfect tool that never had any problems. And now it seems like, there are people talking about, hey, you can't overdo this. Hey, let's be more cautious and do it more carefully, and not so much.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not. I have no desire to fearmonger against fasting, but if you look at it just from a common sense standpoint, like we know that the more muscle tissue you have, the better you're going to age. Like that's a pretty, generally understood and accepted philosophy. Now, if we look at it from a common sense standpoint with regard to fasting, it's going to be harder to build and maintain muscle if you're never eating. Like it's just common sense. So, some strategic extended fasting, totally fine. Overdoing it, certainly not optimal for building and preserving lean tissue. So I think, knowing where that line exists and then not overdoing it is very important.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Sorry, my dog has just been making so much noise during this interview.
Totally fine.
Okay. So I have grilled you with a ton of questions, and I have one more, I guess. What would you say? Are you ever too old to get started? A lot of people have, a lot of people I work with have never, done any kind of resistance training, don't really know anything about it. I always tell them, like, start with a trainer and, like, get yourself set up and used to it and learn form and stuff. And then, the world is your oyster. There's a ton of information out there. But what would you say to someone who has never, never done this before? What do they do?
They just start,
and they're older, because there's aches and pains, there's arthritis, there's other kinds of problems. So for that person, but that person is probably the person who most needs to do this, right?
Oh, for sure. I mean, my granny, I think she's like 83, and she's just like gone so downhill because she doesn't move as much. It's just sad to see. And we all have people in our family like this, that they just get older and older, and then they become more hunched over. They have a hard time standing up. They have to use a walker. They have to have people take care of them. Like this just happens to people, and it's sad to see. And so much of that, I'm not going to say can be cured, but can certainly be minimized if they have more muscle tissue, if they have better health, better bone density, all of that stuff. So anybody is going to benefit from placing their body under the demands of this acute and strategic stress, i.e. in the form of weight training. You definitely want to have proper form and technique. You definitely want to make sure your nutrition's dialed in. You want to control for all the variables and get, be as strategic and productive with it as possible. But don't let not having all the answers be a limiting factor that keeps you from doing it in the first place. Like simply get out there and start. And then from there, you immerse yourself in, the different techniques. And you can pull up YouTube and figure out what any technique is. And you can just start somewhere, start where you're at. Ease into it and add to it. I oftentimes point to Nurse Cindy as an example. She's a sweetheart. Everybody knows her in the space. I've had her on my podcast several times. She goes to many of these conferences. I forget her age. I want to say, I don't want to butcher it, but I want to say 60 something. I think early 60s, if I remember correctly. If she's listening to this, hopefully she doesn't crucify me. But she was really hesitant to start weight training until the past year or so. So she started weight training. I've been trying to nag her into doing it for years, but she just started. And then I saw her for the first time after having not seen her from the whole pandemic for 2 years. And I swear she looked 10 years younger. Like her eyes had a sparkle to them. Like everything just looked better. Her skin was different. Like her body was noticeably different. And the only thing that she changed was she added in weight training. Like it truly is one of the most profound things you could do to improve the quality of your life. I honestly think that weight training paired with, quality nutrition in the form of a well-formulated ketogenic carnivore diet is the closest thing we've found as a species to the fountain of youth. So if you get those dialed in, you're going to be rocking and rolling.
So it's not 3: sleep, workout, good food.
Well, sleep too. We can certainly add that as one of the trifecta. That's certainly one of the most important pillars for sure.
Yeah. And I actually had a question. So is deep sleep where you're building muscle? And do you miss, if you don't get enough sleep, are you missing that period? Or if you go to bed too late? Because there's a lot of night owls who are carnivores.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, you just gotta get to sleep in sometime. Like for people that are night owls, then they sleep later in the morning. So they're getting, ideally the same amount of total sleep. I'm interesting. I got an Oura ring. I track my sleep, and it says that I get pretty good deep sleep, but hardly any REM sleep. And it's normally the opposite. Most people get a lot of REM sleep and no deep sleep. So I'm not really sure why I'm like that. Maybe because I wake up early and you get a lot of the REM, the last few hours of your sleep cycle. That's probably why my REM's so low. But yeah, I think, proper recovery is key. You can have the best training sessions in the world, but if you're not building muscle because you're not recovering, then it's all for naught. So making sure you're recovering is very important. And honestly, making sure you're in a caloric surplus is going to help with that recovery tremendously. Like if you're chronically under eating, you're not going to sleep that great. You're going to be in the sympathetic nervous state most of the time. That's not going to bode well for recovery. So having periods of time in a surplus, making sure you're recovering, making sure you're sleeping, making sure your stress levels are low, all of those things are just good general, factors that are going to improve the quality of your life.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Okay. Well, is there anything you would like to share? How do you work with clients? Can people work with you? Where do people find you?
Yeah, so I definitely work with clients. It's funny, all of my marketing and everything online is kind of marketed towards competitive clients, but my biggest demographic clients are probably middle-aged females. I think it's the majority within the keto carnivore space. But yeah, I work with people with all walks of life. You don't have to be a competitor. I definitely love working with competitors. That's kind of like my wheelhouse and passion. But I love working with people that want to improve the quality of their life and health. So any and all things me is found at Keto Savage, ketosavage.com, Keto Savage on social, on YouTube, on Instagram. All that is just Keto Savage. You search that and you'll find me.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you letting me grill you here. I didn't give you much time to go into your story, but these are the kinds of questions that I get all the time and that I have myself. And so it was really helpful to hear that from an expert.
No, I'm happy to be grilled. I love these kind of questions. I love talking with people like yourself. So happy to do it.
All right, folks. So you heard it here. This is the thing you've got to do. Get out there, do your resistance training. It's never too old to start. And there's tons of information. So you can do it. Get started.
Thank you.